lesson in law is about to take place. It's the perfect thing to perk you up after a satiating lunch. And first I'm going to introduce Ed Dodson, and what we're going to talk about is a true single taxer, a friend of Henry George's named Jackson Ralston, who not only helped our movement for decades in a very practical sense, but was also highly respected as an international lawyer. He worked on, well, Ed's going to tell you all that. But the life of Jackson Ralston is fascinating, and he helped our movement in Maryland dramatically. And at the end, I'm going to give 5 or so minutes, maybe 10 minutes, on the law of the state of Maryland that permits us to be active here in the state. So, folks, Ed.
It's always dangerous to applaud before the speaker does his thing or her thing. And you just had lunch, so my job is to keep you awake somehow. Let's see, how about a computer that will come back on? You have to give me a second. It's been idle too long, and I have to log back in. As Josh indicated, this single taxer named Jackson Ralston is a name. It is. I guess I just have the brain close. Yeah. He's someone that I doubt many of us have heard about much or read about much, but he's definitely someone who's worth taking a look at, and if you have some time, reading some of what he wrote. Real scholarly, dedicated single taxer who managed to navigate both the professional and political worlds very, very well. Now, some of you know that I have made it sort of a commitment to try to create an online biographical history of the Georgist movement. And some of you may not even be aware that you're listed in that record for better or worse. And Jackson Ralston is one of the personalities that I was able to resurrect some of his writings. So if this talk about him today interests you and you want to learn more, some of his writings are available online in the biographical history section of the School of Cooperative Individualism website, and Dan's going to show you that link page. So that's where you would go to just click on the links and his writings that are there, and eventually this lecture will be up on there as well. So I've titled this Jackson Ralston, His Leading Role in Single Tax Near Misses, and a Life Devoted to the Rule of Law and to Just Principles. That tells you a lot about him right away. So there's a small city not far from Baltimore, where just under a year between 1892 and 1893, the city actually adopted a single tax on the value of land. This is the town of Hyattsville, Maryland. The city of Hyattsville was incorporated in 1886, and by 1890 the city was one of only 2 cities in Prince George's County with a population greater than 1,000 people. At the time, a resident of Hyattsville named Jackson Ralston led an effort to change the way revenue was raised to pay for public goods and services. Ralston was born in 1857 in Sacramento, California. After his father's death a few years later, his mother took the family east to live in Oyster Bay and Ithaca in New York, then to Washington, D.C. After entering the printing trade, he managed to earn a law degree at Georgetown University Law School. He graduated in 1876. Sometime in the 1880s, Ralston attended a lecture by Henry George at a labor union meeting and almost immediately joined with others to promote Henry George's policy solutions to the land question. In 1882, he formed a law partnership in the District of Columbia. A good part of his law practice was devoted to searching of land titles, so he intuitively grasped the significance of Henry George's message. Ralston's standing in his community resulted in his election in 1892 to the position of president of the Board of Commissioners. He and 2 other members of the board were committed single taxers, and they led an effort to abolish all taxes upon property improvements. They managed to secure from the Maryland legislature authority to make such deductions or exemptions from or additions to the assessment figures set by the town's assessors, based on what the board itself determined to be appropriate and just based on market data. In other words, to overturn what the professional assessors said the value of land might be. The board proceeded to exempt all improvements from taxation and to raise the rate of taxation on land values from 15 to 25 cents per $100. No sooner had the new system been put into place than, you guess it, opponents went to court to have the changes overturned. The complainants appealed to the Circuit Court of Prince George's County for a writ of mandamus, directing the commissioners to include personal property and improvements in their assessment and restraining the collection of taxes already levied. The court denied the writ and upheld as lawful the action of the single taxers. The case was then taken before the Maryland Court of Appeals. That court denied the appeal on the ground that the action of the petitioners was wrongfully brought, that they should have proceeded by way of injunction and not by mandamus. However, the court also declared that the action of the single taxers was in violation of the Maryland Constitution and would be so held by the court. The single taxers, seeing that to continue would invite their defeat, gave up the experiment. Hyattsville's brief experiment with Henry George's system was brought to an end. Other single taxers were working for legislative changes under the banner of the Maryland Single Tax League, headquartered in the Calvert building here in Baltimore. A man named J. Ogle, O-G-L-E, served as secretary of the organization. Across the Potomac River in the District of Columbia, a woman named Jessie Lane, who resided in Riverdale, Maryland, served as president of the Women's Single Tax Club. Wouldn't it be great if we had women's single tax clubs still existing all across the United States and Canada and maybe elsewhere? So some of you women, think about it.
Women don't do it.
Others decided to follow the lead of Henry George's followers by establishing a single tax colony in a town called Gilpin's Point here in Maryland. Many leading single taxers remained determined to have at least one state in the United States become a single tax state. They chose Delaware, and Ralston was appointed to the National Committee to supervise the Delaware campaign. That campaign ended in failure.
1896.
Ralston believed because single taxers adopted the wrong strategy, as he explained in a 1931 article that appeared in Land and Freedom. Quote, "An active campaign was carried on, and I am entirely justified in my belief that had it been possible to submit a properly drawn concrete proposition to the vote of the citizens of Delaware in the year 1895, such proposition would have met success. This was not possible. It happened that in that year the local element among the single taxers of Delaware determined to nominate a straight party ticket, and candidates were placed in the field for governor, congressman, and various other offices. This was done against the advice and under the protests of the committee, which had been named by the then national body, and which consisted of A. Stevenson, Harold Siddell, I think he was from Philadelphia, and myself. So a most promising movement fell absolutely to pieces. Others can judge whether or not Ralston's assessment was correct. Ralston continued in this article to elaborate on the errors in strategy he believed caused the marginalizing of single tax advocacy in the years that followed. In particular, he pointed to the efforts in California and Oregon to convince voters to approve immediate adoption of a single tax. Following the Delaware campaign, Ralston found time to earn a Doctor of Law degree from National University in Washington, D.C., and he received that in 1897, same year Henry George died. Ralston's philosophical principles also brought him to join the National Anti-Imperialist League, where he served as legal counsel during 1910 and 1911. In 1910, he also participated in the Single Tax Conference held that November in New York City. His views on foreign relations were expressed in remarks he delivered at a 1914 meeting, later reprinted. He wrote, "The American Peace Society is 86 years old, as we are told. Within that time, it has, of course, done a great deal in the way of education, in the way of propaganda, and for many years to come, it will be possible to continue that work. But something more, in my judgment, is necessary. Propaganda work has, after all, a certain academic nature. It does not appeal to the imaginations of men. It does not appeal to their hearts to a large degree. And it is not that concrete, practical application which so often appeals to the American mind. There are concrete, practical questions coming up all the time, and we are not altogether meeting them. You must ask men to do something. You must have their strategy, their energies directed to certain important, definite propositions." That paragraph kind of sounds like our whole conversation so far as we've come together this time. No, he was not addressing an audience of single taxers in that case, but his message would likely have been the same had this been the case. During 1915, he helped to draft a referendum constitutional amendment that was adopted by Maryland. In 1916, he was drafted by the Democratic Party to stand for election to the U.S. House of Representatives from the 5th Maryland District. Jackson Ralston decided to retire from his law practice in 1924. He was then 67 years old. He returned to live in California, residing in the city of Palo Alto. He was one of the nation's leading legal experts on international law, authoring the book International Arbitration from Athens to Locarno, published in 1929. He continued his involvement in the now contracting Georgist movement, serving as a delegate to the 1930 Henry George Congress held in San Francisco. That same year, he authored a pamphlet titled An Unshackled Civilization, reviewed by the editors of Land and Freedom, who concluded the author had made, quote, a rather too cautious advocacy of our principles, but is good as far as it goes. Far from dismayed, Ralston came out with a new book in 1931 titled What's Wrong with Taxation? He challenged economists to give a more thorough and objective study to the potential effects of the taxation of land values. He wrote, "Their productions have generally revealed a want of appreciation of its fundamental and inescapable principles. Their errors have received little analysis and have, for want of exposure, influenced much current thought among legislators and taxing authorities. It is in an endeavor to place local taxation upon a firm and logical basis that this book is written." And I've had an opportunity to read parts of it, and it still has many valid arguments to make for us today. That same year, he attempted to provide guidance to the dwindling number of devoted Henry George followers. He wrote, "For more than 40 or even 50 years, the single taxers of this country have been wandering in the wilderness and still find themselves as far from the promised land as they were at the beginning of such period. We have been resting quietly on our oars and discussing theoretical considerations and how far economic rent should be taken for public purposes, instead of addressing ourselves to the more practical question of the methods of taking increasing portions of such rent for the use of the state. My proposition is that carefully prepared constitutional amendments be submitted to the vote of the people, which amendments will provide substantially that during each of the succeeding 10 or 20 years there shall be an exemption by all taxing jurisdictions of 10 or 5% of the value of improvements. and at the beginning of such period, all tangible personal property shall be exempt from taxation. Sounds like your model for Maryland, Josh, or for Baltimore. The respect earned by Jackson Ralston outside the community of single taxers is indicated by the reading in the United States Senate by Hendrik Shipstead of Minnesota of a statement written by Ralston titled The American Way Forward. This occurred on the 24th of April, 1936, and subsequently appeared in the Congressional Record. Senator Shipstead provided this introduction. Mr. President, since the foundation of our Union, our system of taxation has always contrived to shift the burden from the privileged few to the backs of the consuming masses. It is a vital and threatening issue before the national government and every state as well. Jackson Ralston, true to the strategy he embraced, proposed an amendment to the United States Constitution for a gradual elimination of sales taxes, then all other taxes to be replaced by land value taxation. At the 5th International Conference to promote LVT and free trade, held that September in London, Ralston presented a paper updating attendees on the efforts being made to similarly amend the California Constitution. He wrote, in 1933, the legislature of California, under the influence and control at the instigation of the great landed interests of the state, so changed the Constitution as to make a sales tax practically inevitable. The State Federation of Labor endorsed the proposed amendment at its annual convention. The state's real estate boards and the State Chamber of Commerce vigorously opposed the amendment. As Ralston explained, our opponents complain of us very bitterly because we have united a repeal of sales tax with the abolition of taxes on improvements and tangible personal property. We believe the man who is opposed to the sales tax can readily be educated to the point of antagonism to the other taxes of which I have spoken. The California campaign failed, although between 300,000 to 400,000 Californians voted in favor of the amendment. Ralston was not dismayed. He stated, there will always be a question of methods. We know that any attempt to invoke too great a change at once invites disaster. We were sufferers from the past efforts of this sort, and we may ourselves have attempted too much in a limited time. This point requires a great deal of thought. Now the problem was one of timing. The priorities of thoughtful people were changing as economic depression moved to the background and the threat of global war was intensified. Even so, Ralston urged new campaigns guided by the lessons learned. He wrote, first, of course, methods of education and economics are to be cultivated. Next, we must develop popular government. The initiative and referendum must be materially revised and extended to new states. More importantly, we must study a new approach. I am sure that at some point the citadel of privilege will be found vulnerable. What that point may be, I am not wise enough to say today. Want of success in our endeavors proves we have not yet struck the weakest spot. With the war erupting around the globe, Ralston applied his legal mind to the problems of international law. The result was the book A Quest for International Order, appearing in mid-1941. He concluded that the global system of national sovereignties stood in the way of both peace and progress, asking who created that imaginary thing called the state and endowed it with the mythical sovereignty and independence. He also argued that essential to the just society is, quote, an equal share in the offerings of nature and the highest degree of comfort. His Georgist principles were firmly on display. With the United States fully mobilized in war against the Japanese and Germans, Ralston continued his process of self-examination. He pulled his thoughts together in an article that appeared in Land and Freedom's September-October 1942 issue, largely repeating what he stated and wrote in prior years. He said, "We are still suffering, though in diminishing measure, from the evangelism of 40 or 50 years ago, when adherents to the principles we know to be sound slogan themselves into the category of schemes to get utopia overnight. The result is that men in positions of authority who are receptive to logical procedure in harmony with those principles can be scared out of their reason by someone yelling, "Single tax!" As the Second World War was coming to its end, Ralston once more sought to bring public attention to the Georgist cause with a new book titled Confronting the Land Question, published in 1945. In the foreword, he paid homage to Henry George. Quote, he laid down the basic principles upon which all government must rest if the progress of mankind is to be furthered. Yet he admitted to the possibility that changing conditions warranted constant re-examination of systems of law and taxation embraced. He added, we will all agree that justice should prevail and equality of opportunity among men. But what is justice? How can we know absolutely when we are just or even protecting human rights? Will certain means absolutely bring about the ends aimed at? Are they the best attainable? We know that in all scientific matters, we ask these questions, and as to them, we are always striving for perfection. Why must this not be the case in the elusive science we are studying? Perhaps he had some sense that his time was short. He died of a cerebral thrombosis in October in his 89th year. His last writing for a Georgist audience appeared in the May 1945 issue of the Henry George News, in which he raised the question, do business leaders want free enterprise? His answer was that their opposition to the program he repeatedly put forward confirmed their opposition to free enterprise. William C. Dennis remembered Ralston's long career in the law in the January 1946 issue of the American Journal of International Law, writing, Mr. Ralston's career was typically American. His long life was crowded and with varied and useful accomplishment in all three of the vocations from which the ranks of our American Society of International Law are mainly recruited: the practice of law, law teaching, and public service. And an altogether too brief remembrance of him appeared in the Henry George News without authorship. It stated, Ralston's widow, Opal, provided funds in 1972 to establish the Jackson H. Ralston Prize in International Law at the Stanford Law School. The first Jackson H. Ralston lecture was delivered there in 1985 by Tommy Koh, K-O-H, the then ambassador to the United States from Singapore. His subject was the future of the United Nations. Ralston would have found it encouraging that the United Nations had in fact survived a tumultuous first 4 decades. Thank you. I'm not really prepared to take very many questions, only because I've done the research to give you the basic facts of his life, but in no way do I pretend to know Jackson Ralston. It would require a lot longer study of his writings, and that's why I pointed you to that page, at least the ones that I've been able to resurrect and put online. But if you can find any of his books in a used bookstore, I think they're worthwhile taking a second look at.
Are you taking a few questions?
I'll be glad to try, but Josh may be in a better position to answer some of the questions you have. How about if we let Josh talk, and then the both of us will take questions based on our sense of which ones we might be able to answer. I didn't even notice what the joke was. I did the old. Sorry. You gonna do your Churchill impersonation?
Formidable. Okay, I'm going to spend a very few minutes, and where's my timer? There he is. Describing exactly why we have a great opportunity in Maryland to enact land value taxation all the way to the state level. And it's due to this giant of the legal of legal history, Jackson Ralston. Now, what I'm going to do is reference, if I can get my, there we go, is reference the winning document that was produced in 1995 by then Maryland Attorney General Joseph Curran. The Henry George Foundation and Walt and many other people had pushed for, Mike O'Mara had pushed for a land value tax enabling legislation in the Maryland Assembly. It was shot down dead, which is sort of happens a lot in our story. But it was shot down dead by people who didn't really understand why. And as Delegate Davis said yesterday, it was mostly suburban DC border counties that sort of ganged up against it. The proponent was Delegate Mike Gordon, who was also from Montgomery County from Rockville. And he was irked that the bill was defeated, of course, and we decided as a group, and Jack Jones of Riverdale, who some of you have met, we haven't seen him in a few years. So we started with the Constitution and read it really deeply, and none of us were attorneys, and we didn't even play them well on TV. But what was interesting is that we made the request to the Attorney General through Delegate Gordon's office, and we asked 3 questions. Does Article 15 of the Maryland Declaration of Rights, which is its constitution, grant authority for a 2-tier taxation system? 2, may a separate classification be created just for land? 3, do municipalities already have the authority to establish the classifications proposed in House Bill 525 of the 1994 session, which was vetoed by the governor? And by the way, that governor was William Donald Schaefer, who was the mayor of Baltimore and then became the governor. And essentially, in one sentence, yes, all of this is legal, all of this is constitutional, and all of this is statutorily permissible right now for cities. If the city of Rockville or the city of Frederick decided to enact a land value tax, they could.
Or
right?
Hyattsville.
Or Hyattsville, as the case may be. So Article 15, and I want to get to the cool part. Here we go. Is the part that was written by Jackson Ralston. The General Assembly shall, by uniform rules, provide for separate assessment of land and classification and subclassification of improvements on land and personal property, as it may deem proper. In other words, knock yourself out. Exempt land, fine. Exempt buildings, fine. But whatever the choice is, it is up to the legislature, to the state legislature. And all taxes thereafter provided to be levied by the state. Maryland has a state property tax. State government, and by the counties and by the city of Baltimore for the respective purposes shall be uniform as to land within the taxing district and uniform within the class or subclass of improvements. We've already defined in the Constitution that these are 2 different items altogether, land and improvements. And it says the towns, the state, the counties, and Baltimore City. But that means then that it goes to the legislature and they have to pass enabling legislation. So Jackson Ralston opened the door, and I think gives us some real ammunition in other states that already exists to actually change state constitutions. If on that day there are 10,000 of us gathering at a convention center trying to come up with ideas, which I have no doubt will happen. In Maryland, meanwhile, Jackson Ralston, thank you, had moved back to California, but Prince George's County, which again is where Hyattsville is, and many other small communities on the border of DC. I have 10 minutes. I asked for 5. Okay. they asked for permission as towns to enact land value tax permission from the state legislature. And it was granted in the year 1916 in Act 656. And it was tricky to find, and I'm happy to say the Henry George Foundation did the sort of legal legwork to find this bill, which of course had not been digitized and put into the modern statutes and the modern codes, because it was just one act out of thousands that are passed in the decades. So Act 656 says land value tax for towns and cities. And over the years, they improved the property tax statutes, Chapter 81 in the Maryland statutes, and they improved it so much that they removed the permission for land value tax to a footnote. It was there, but it was a footnote, so people just didn't notice it. So fast forward to today, and we have the situation that we're faced with, that Tiger Davis is faced with, that we have all the legal machinery working for us, but the political machinery is frozen, it's stuck. And so that's why we're here. Thanks to Jackson Ralston, we may move forward, but thanks to all of us, Delegate Davis and the citizens of Baltimore and the business people of Baltimore, we have to take that one extra step to get permission. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Questions for Ed? Do we have someone picking questions, or we just?
Yeah. I have PDFs of both of Ralston's books. If anybody wants a copy, you'll need a good-sized thumb drive, because one's 15 gig, or 15 megabytes, and one's 10. But if you want those, I've got them.
I'd like to get them from you, Wynn. Add them to what I have online. For sure.
If you call on people, one in advance of the one you're calling on, I can get the mic to them ahead of
I'm
time.
trying to recognize whose hands are up first. So
Yeah, but call on two people, one who speaks now, one who's going to speak.
Alan, Wayne.
Okay, I just wanted to ask.
Wait. I just wanted to ask Josh if there's anybody is it Hyattsville?
Yes.
How many people there are interested in LVT?
Currently, I would say none. But as recently as 10 years ago, City Council commissioned us to do a study of LVT, and the upshot was they were afraid it would upset development decisions. We keep running into that creepy word, development. But Riverdale Park and Hyattsville were interested. And I can also say that other towns, Colmar, Heights, and one other, these are small towns, enacted a 2-rate tax. Unfortunately, they perceived the advantage to be a higher rate for commercial properties and a lower rate for residential properties, because those are subclassifications. So we're trying. I think Frederick and Brunswick are our best opportunities for right now.
Anyone here know where Hyattsville is in Prince George's County? How many live within driving distance of that community? Well, Rick, maybe you and Walt, others, take the talk I just gave. Set up something at the public library to invite people to come to and give the talk about Jackson Ralston and get them excited about one of their, early civic leaders. Maybe that'll get them pumped up. I don't know. But if I had someone significant in my community to talk about, I'd do that. But there's no one in my community who's significant. Yeah, no one wants to hear about me. Yeah, there's got to be somebody in my township years and decades ago that did something important and significant, but I haven't found out who that might be. Wayne, you were next.
Who's after Wayne?
Is there another hand up that I missed? Okay, Marty, and then on this side, who?
David.
Okay, Marty and then Dave.
Did you hear me?
We can hear you.
Tap the bottom.
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, so
We
You
can't hear you.
got it the wrong way.
Oh, you pushed it and it went off.
Yeah, you just have to tap it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think almost 40 years ago, there was an excellent article in the California History magazine about Jackson Ralston and the attempt to pass a single tax initiative in California during the 1930s. Of course, it went down in defeat, like a lot of things, but it also mentioned that his chief assistant was none other than Noah Elper, who many of the older people know. He's from lives in
St.
St.
Louis.
Louis. Yes. I just wanted to make a comment.
I'm not sure, I might have picked that up, I'll have to take a look. What year did you say that was, Wayne?
I forget the exact year, but I have a copy at home.
While Ed's looking it up.
Okay.
Marty.
So I had a question for Josh, or maybe a comment. The principle of getting the state constitution and the state laws amenable for a single tax is unquestionably the key thing to do. And I guess, understanding the principle of federalism, I think people should really understand that it's really futile to not do that, because you don't want to end up like the Delaware campaign and all those kind of things, and what we just heard about. So could you describe, besides the work that you're doing, going to the research for each state and have that at least as high as an important aspect of the organizing as educating?
Essentially, what you're asking is, where are the chances best? What states? When somebody wants something, by somebody I mean powerful people, when they want something and it violates the Constitution, there's always a way to drive a truck through it. And if powerful people want land value tax, they would get it, even in a state that says you'll be burned if you do land value tax. But there are many states that in the Midwest, in the Northeast, and the Rocky Mountain states that really don't provide much in the way of obstacles, up to and including New England states that have a semi-Prop 13, Prop 2.5. There are really demands, and this is where a lot of confusion, I think, comes from in legislative research bureaus. And again, I'm not an attorney, and if there's an attorney that wants to jump up at any point, okay, that it's mostly a prohibition against different forms of assessment. In other words, unlike the western provinces of Canada, where improvements are valued at 50% of value and land at 100% of value, states really are pretty avid, and I think that's fine, I guess, of making sure that assessments are uniform and valued at the same ratio. Or, like in the southern states, residential is assessed at 10% of value, all the way up to commercial that's assessed at up to 40% of value. Alabama comes to mind. So Washington, D.C. has a very peculiar, and it seems like a good system, of having 5 classes of property with the highest rate on vacant and blighted buildings. I don't know how it works out. Rick can probably answer that in his segment. But most states, there's no obvious problem, but there's institutional problems and cultural problems. So something like the Ralston proposal is very innocuous sounding. It even mentions golf courses and things of that nature, country clubs. And it sounds pretty benign, and that's what I think we could work on. It sounds like we're doing a public service, and of course we have to protect the farmers.
And Wayne, I don't seem to have it, so if you could photocopy that article and send it to me, that would be great.
I got a question for Ed, just a technical question really. You referred several times to a magazine, Land and Freedom. And I'm wondering if actually that was Land and Liberty.
Nope.
It definitely isn't. Okay.
Our-
Because certainly when you're referring to the London conference, that would have been reported in Land and Liberty, and if it were of interest, then
Well, the easy answer is that a lot of the papers delivered at the annual conferences, the international as well as North American conferences, were reprinted in more than one publication. So you often see them, what editors consider to be worth reprinting, appearing in Land and Liberty, Land and Freedom, the Henry George News, et cetera, et cetera.
thank you.
Next, did I see any more hands? Have we satisfied your curiosities?
Well,
I think we have.
since I have the mic,
Oh.
I just, they were asking how these things get passed, and in Pennsylvania, we had a Georgist who ran for the legislature, and he ran for the legislature to get the land tax option for all of the cities of Pennsylvania, because only Pittsburgh and Scranton had it, and in all the time of the legislature, he did lots and lots of good things, but they never followed him up on what he ran for, which was to get land value tax, until he was retiring. And the reason his name was Bernard McGinnis, and they said, let's do this for old Barney as his goodbye, as his retirement present from the state legislature. So legislators act for the most difficult to understand reasons.
There's just a sort of a related comment about some of the research I've done on various, Georgist legislators. And there have been various members of single taxers in the United States Congress. And it seems like, from what I've been able to learn, they were always treated with respect, but totally ignored. And I ran across a similar sort of story about an Australian named Clyde Cameron. I don't know, Dave, if you've ever heard of him, but he served in the Australian Parliament for a long time. And every time he gave a speech, it was on behalf of the single tax. And they politely let him speak and totally ignored him. When?
Am I correct that Hyattsville is a fairly poor town? I have in mind that I had a chance to drive through there, and I may be blurring the town lines, but I got the sense of a place that was in real need of redevelopment.
Hyattsville has transformed into a real bedroom community.
Okay.
And it's middle class, maybe upper middle class some areas. It's really not very poor. A lot of the surrounding towns, and they're all identical, they're called the port towns, I think. And many of them are poor, but Hyattsville, I think they're doing okay.
Okay, I was on one main drag, and I thought
Hold
I
the mic
identified
up.
it as Hyattsville.
Hold the mic up.
It helps if I turn it on. I was on one main drag, and I think I was in Hyattsville, and I was also navigating for myself, so I was only half-minded on this being Hyattsville.
How far is Hyattsville from Arden?
Quite a distance. It's right in the Washington burbs, and I had a sleeping passenger, and I got to explore a little bit. So.
Alana?
Okay, since Dan mentioned
turn it on.
the red light's on, does it turn it on?
You gotta tap into.
That means you're not allowed to talk.
Okay, is this all right?
Yeah.
So Dan mentioned legislator McGinnis,
He
and they
decades of
passed.
this, the Single Tax Review, which I think was the leading magazine of the U.S. movement. They changed its name and changed its format to be more appealing, and went out of business. So the other footnote is Clyde Cameron, as I recall, delivered a speech which RSF has on CD, it's not with me, called How Labor Lost Its Way. And earlier this morning, when Clarence was talking, he used that phrase, labor lost its way. And it made me think of Cameron, and now you've mentioned him again, Ed. Thank you.
I have that CD. It's worth acquiring and listening to.
So we're good? I hope
Whoever-
this illuminating.
Whoever wrote the program didn't write in any break times. So if we end now, we get a 15-minute break.
And let's end.